Dear listeners, in my presentation, I will introduce a well-known Estonian stage performer of traditional oral song, Laine Mesikäpp. A major part of her career as a singer fell into the Soviet period, and during the Stalinist period, compositions by Laine Mesikäpp and her followers constituted a part of the Soviet folklore created upon the commission of the Central Power. However, her position as a creator of Soviet folklore was a very short stage in her long creative period. Even during the Stalinist era, her performances could be interpreted differently, depending on the listener's ideological background and aesthetic preferences. In my paper, I try to shed light on the wide space of interpretation of Laine Mesikäpp's performances by asking what these performances meant to her listeners in different times and to herself. As a background, I look at processes connected to the stage practices of traditional song in Estonia. The main focus is on Soviet time. Estonian researcher Epp Annus has formulated the paradoxes of Soviet colonial rule established over modern nation states. The descent and intertwining of pre-Soviet and Soviet ideologies and imaginaries of national and Soviet modernities brought with it hybridity and ambivalent attitudes, which can also be seen in Laine Mesikäpp's case. As a source material, I have used media and archive materials as well as recollections of Laine Mesikäpp's contemporaries and myself. I am especially grateful to the singer's niece, Õilme Krell. Laine had no children herself, and Laine's singing companion and pupil in her old age, Marika Oja, for sharing their memories of Laine Mesikäpp. First of all, I will briefly list the main events in the life of Laine Mesikäpp. She was born and grew up in a small village Adila near Hageri, about 40 kilometers south of Tallinn. Probably in 1938, she joined the folk dance group in Tallinn and started also singing and telling stories there. As she was a talented performer, she was employed as an actor at the Endla Theatre in Pärnu in 1942. In 1944, Laine Mesikäpp moved to Tallinn and worked there as an actor until 1992. In 1947, she opened the dance festival that accompanied the first Soviet time all-Estonian song festival with a self-composed Runo song. Her career as a singer and a mistress of the dance festival lasted until 1994. In 1997, after her 80th jubilee, Laine Mesikäpp started singing in the folklore group Leigarid in Tallinn and sang there for many years. In the repertoire and performance style of Laine Mesikäpp, premodern and modern aesthetics came together. Her sources of inspiration were, on the one hand, contacts with singers and performance situations representing the pre-modern tradition. Her grandmother had been a wedding singer. She sang herding calls and vocalizes that were later characteristic of Laine's own performances. Laine's home was a place of coming together for the village youth. There the traditional customs were practiced and parties were held. And when Laine was already in a folk dance group, she met and learned from the best old traditional singers brought to the stage in the 1920s and 30s to represent nationally symbolic historical song tradition. On the other hand, Laine's family and she herself participated in the local institutional cultural life. And since primary school, Laine was a constant performer on stage. Her individual style of traditional singing developed during the performances with her dance group, and later it was shaped by her performance as an actor and by the fact that she received voice coaching in the theatre. Laine has claimed to her pupil Marika Oja that she made a conscious decision not to copy the style of the traditional singers. We don't have any recordings made before 1947 Song Festival, but I assume that the performance style of Laine Mesikäpp did not change significantly in Soviet time compared to the earlier years. The musical side of her performances was characterized by variety, blending old traditional songs, regilaulu or runo songs, calls typical of a shepherd's repertoire, imitations of bird songs, and using different melodies within one song. She sang alone, but in the older tradition, the choir repeated the verse first sung by the lead singer. Her texts contained traditional verses combined with verses created by herself in traditional style. In Soviet time, they contained also political messages commissioned by the political officials, and her performance style was quite expressive, energetic and cheerful. She used gesticulating characteristic of actors. The singer had a naturally beautiful resounding voice, and her intonation was more controlled compared to the traditional singers. The modernized performance style of Laine Mesikäpp combined with her youth really brought her success, as we can read from the reviews of the concerts of traditional music from the time of German occupation during World War II. There was no fundamental change in performance practices of traditional song after 1944 in the context of Soviet regime. After World War II, the folk art evenings were organized in the same way they had taken place before the Soviet era, using the same elderly traditional as well as young performers, including Laine Mesikäpp. Many of the musicians who performed at these concerts also performed at the folk art evening of the 1947 all-Estonian Song Festival, which was the first Soviet time song festival. As said, Laine Mesikäpp opened that evening with her runo song, which was combined with herding calls. We can suggest that due to pre-Soviet concerts, the singing of Laine Mesikäpp and some other young singers was already quite well known. But after the 1947 festival, it became extremely popular. Here is an example of opening calls recorded at the Folk Dance Festival of 1965.
Nagu kusagilt aegade hämarikust kõlevad need muistsed hääled. Tulge suurele peole! Tegelikult on lustakas rahvakunstiõhtu meie pikas laulupeo traditsioonis noorem isegi Nõukogude Eestis. Noor, vallatu ja lennukas.
I would dare to guess that behind the extraordinary popularity of the so-called opening runo song is the possibility of different, even opposite interpretations. On one side, Laine Mesikäpp fulfilled an official political commission. The performers were expected to improvise political songs that would represent the Soviet folklore required by the Central Powers and to add the socialist content to the festivals. On the other side, the performance of old traditional songs, exactly the same way as it was in the pre-Soviet time, carried a symbolic national meaning. It was associated with independence and decolonial mentality. A lot of song texts in Laine Mesikäpp's archive are completely unpolitical, and so were also the words of the opening song of the all-Estonian festival in 1947. Due to the direct association with the pre-Soviet time, Laine Mesikäpp's performances may have symbolized non-Soviet national values until the end of Soviet time, especially for the pre-war generation. Here is an example of the media reports from 1947 that linked Laine Mesikäpp's performance to the past and nationally meaningful imaginaries. The obligatory political motives in Mesikäpp's song texts may have been viewed as a formality necessary to get on the stage. Of course, several more ambivalent interpretations reflecting a certain internalization of Soviet mentality were possible. I would like to emphasize the generational aspect connected to different interpretations of Laine Mesikäpp's performances. When I was young, to me, as a representative of the generation born in the 1960s, Laine Mesikäpp's performances somehow associated with the theatrical representations of tradition that were practiced in the Soviet Union and shown on television during state holidays. These shows were masterly. Professionality was an official model of amateur performance. But the theatrical joyousness, which was obligatory in the Soviet scheme, perhaps especially since Stalin's campaign in the mid-1930s, was aesthetically too foreign and fake. Laine Mesikäpp's performances were also joyful, energetic, and expressive. This arose from the singer's personality, but for me it created a kind of association with Soviet or Russian stage style in the context of ritualized grandiosity typical of Soviet festivals. It seems to me that the answer to the question if Laine Mesikäpp's performances represented national or Soviet modernity depends on the listener's experience in some sense. Whether the listener recognized the familiar pre-Soviet representation of Runo song or rather the elements of the folklore performances in the unified Soviet style in the Laine Mesikäpp's performances. The folk revival that had been advancing in Estonia since the 1970s brought with it a new ground for interpretation of Laine Mesikäpp's activity. Laine Mesikäpp supported young revivalists. The movement was inherently decolonial and Laine shared their attitudes. Another reason was a respect of the revivalists for former traditional singers with whom Laine had been personally and emotionally connected. The generation of revival, in turn, valued Laine Mesikäpp's experience and skills acquired from old singers. On the other side, in principle, all modern elements in the stage performances of traditional song as well as dance did not match the aesthetics of the folk revival. This discrepancy also included a political aspect. Modernized and professional stage performances were associated with the Soviet official style, which embodied the Soviet power and its ideology. The connection with the modernized style from the time of Estonia's independence seemed to be lost in the social memory, or it was not actual in the political context of that time. And it seems to me that the ideology of folk revival influenced Laine to bring out more traditional features in her performances to a certain extent. Here is an example in which she and Igor Tõnurist, one leading figures of the Estonian folk revival, sing a swinging song that Laine had obviously learned in her youth from an elderly singer, Mari Kilu. Here Laine imitates the style of this elderly singer quite convincingly. And here and in some other later recordings, Laine Mesikäpp has sung with a following singer or a choir like was usual in the tradition, not solo like she used to.
Mehe kikele kikuhu maie.
Mehe kikele kikuhu
Maie kas see kikehe kannahab meida.
see kikehe kannahab
Meida sina kriuksuhut kikehe kene.
sina kriuksuhut kikehe
Kene.
Nevertheless, a certain aesthetical distance remained between Laine and the folk revivalists. And when Laine joined the singing group of the folklore ensemble Leegerid after her 80th birthday, both sides had to make compromises in order to make the joint performances work.
Mehe.
Finally, I will briefly touch on Laine Mesikäpp's own interpretation of her activity, focusing on ideological aspects, because her aesthetic preferences have already been discussed above. For Laine herself, the main idea of her activities as a singer was maintaining national values. It was not only the politically accepted Soviet nationalism. A clear decolonial mentality is obvious in the singer's attitudes. Based on her own memories, in the performances at the dance festival, Laine Mesikäpp tried to use as few political messages required by the authorities as possible. Constantly testing the limits of the possible was characteristic of the society and creation alike. It should be added that the fear experienced during the Soviet occupation was an important factor that influenced Laine's choices. She said to have claimed about unpleasant political choices she made, "Yes, I learned the role, I played it, but in actual reality I hated it." For Laine Mesikäpp, nationalism was closely linked to farm life that has consistently held an important position in the cultural imaginary of Estonians. Laine's childhood was closely tied with traditional music, and the atmosphere at her home and her father's interests must have created the pull of the tradition. The reason why Laine, being creative and having a nature of a performer, chose the career of a singer of traditional songs. Besides that, she may have been strongly influenced by her experiences of the ritual energy characteristic of the performances of traditional singers. These experiences could also be intertwined with nostalgia for naturalness and wildness of pre-modern culture, characteristic of modernity. To conclude, in my presentation, I pointed out the variety of interpretations of the meaning of Laine Mesikäpp's performances of traditional song in Soviet times. The reason of such variety of different ambivalent or controversial interpretations lies on one side in Laine Mesikäpp's identity as a singer and in her performance style that can be characterized as being in between pre-modern, national and Soviet modern, as well as non-modern or revivalist aesthetics and ideologies. On the other side, the variety of interpretations depends on historical changes in aesthetical and ideological attitudes, as well as different experience and cultural imaginaries among different generations. Thank you for listening.